resources and what are the barriers for progressing them forward. I think you've got a chance then to write some really good guidance on how to apply those different categories. It's just a subtle change, but you know, it might help the expansion of the system later on, rather than having someone think they're having to move from one system to another system. I think it's just an idea. But absolutely, you're certainly going to be able to move back and forth between the systems.
Thanks, David. I was just going to mention that India has adopted UNSC 2009, and tomorrow we have a working group meeting. I'm going to fly over tonight to join it. We're sponsoring our working group. And I have 3 pieces of data to feed into this, some empirical evidence of having adopted UNSC. The first is that it has to be a staged application, and we have heard from the contractors that it would be easier to start with the UNFC and then go to Crisco, rather than start with Crisco and go to UNFC. That's one observation. The second is that it's interesting in your queue, most of the attention is going on the F1E2 slice. So if you go to your queue, F1E2, resource managers are finding that there are a great many mines in the Indian context that were actually E2, and probably had they appreciated that, they might not have gone into to be mines, right? Get your queue fast enough. There you go. Okay. So they're in the F1E2 slice, right? Yeah, right. And that actually, I think, oddly enough, the way that's showing, that actually is your hot zone. I think you should flip your queue around. Yeah, and then I think that as another input to this meeting, here in the Indian context, we're finding that there needs to be an elaboration of that E-axis even more, the whole socio-economic, environmental governance vision. And then the third thing is that industry is actually focusing on a different part of the queue, which is the F4. Because what they don't want to do is lose resources, or use the term, they don't want to lose mineral lands today that could in the future translate in. And so from a broad landscape planning perspective, it's the F4 that industry is supposed to focus on. Okay. So we'll have this discussion tomorrow, but I just thought it was useful for
David, Charlotte, thanks for the instructor. I have one reflection and one question that keeps on going through my head. Namely, we are talking about from the perspective of the ISA adopting a classification system, but also the industry might have an idea and might have reasons to opt for a certain classification system. So what you might end up with is that industry is using a certain classification system that differs from the system that is going to be adopted by the ISA. One of the likely candidates, for example, for industry might be NI 43-101. Why? Because to my knowledge, it is a system that is to a large extent used in the mining sector. That is a national instrument from the Canadian government that relates very easily to the Australian criteria, to the George, that relates very easily to South African. So what if we end up in a situation like that? Would the Crisco enable us to do the work or the reporting to the ISA without having to do our job 2 times? So I heard you talk about the bridging, but I think the bridging aspect is going, from an industry perspective, is going to be the most important aspect of the discussion. Because I think industry might have, I not want to put facts on the table, but I think some of the industry partners might already have chosen for the system. And perhaps are not willing to change it into a system that might later be adopted by the ISA.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll respond quickly on that. I haven't said a lot so far because obviously quite a bit of what I tend to say will be in my presentations anyway. But just in respect of that particular point that was made, 43101 is a Crisco system. So I think we just need to be clear. 43101 is a Crusco system, as is the JAWS code, as is SAMRIC, etc. So if one company, for example, as will be presented later on TOMA, in terms of reporting under National Instrument 43101, that is in fact consistent with Crusco. There is no, if you like, tension or difference between them.
Yes, I know. But I wanted to put the item on the table, so I heard this mentioned here around the table.
Thank you, David. Just want to try and come back to this issue of what the ISA needs now, not in 5 years' time, but by July of next year for application, possibly in September, when 7, I think it is, possible applications for extension of current contracts land on the table of the authority. I think a lot of what David, if I may say so, talked about this morning, has my mind at least worrying in terms of the exploitation regulations and how the language in that set of documents will emerge. But what's equally critical is that what we need now dovetails over the period of extension of the first obligation contract, so that if we move further forward, as Jacques has just pointed out, there is no doing the job twice to be able to take the process from where some contractors are now to where everybody hopes they will be in probably just on very much more value in, let's say, 5 years' time. What's key to me as a member of the LPC individually is that whatever the standardization process that the ISA looks at has to be acceptable to the contractor. Okay? Whatever else it is, I wouldn't like to be sitting on the LPC considering an application for extension if I knew there was frustration on the part of the contractors that were being asked to do something that they're uncomfortable with. So I think there is this element of we must look towards something that the contractors are comfortable with. And so far in this meeting, if I look at my contractor colleagues and I know them all, they've been conspicuously silent. I would suggest that in terms of what's needed for the ISA by July of next year for the Council for approval for an application during this extension process that will follow immediately, is we want something in the way of language that enables all the contractors to put where they're at in that common language, so that when the authority looks at these applications, and let's accept that they're all in the carrier different zone, some of them will be contiguous, and somebody will need to look at these applications with a view to understanding the language in this 75,000 square kilometers is identical to the language being used for the reporting on the adjacent block, which also may be a 75,000. Otherwise, these 7 applications for extension, all written in different language, none of which we understand. And I think that is the key issue right now around this table, certainly from where I'm sitting, that I would like, with the endorsement and support of the contractors, to arrive at that language, hopefully simple, but dovetailing into UNFCCC, dovetailing into Crystal, dovetailing into Canadian documentation for possible use in the future. And I don't know whether I've confused everybody or not, but that's what I'm sitting at this table listening to here right now. What is it that is that hopefully simple language that enables the contractors to tell us where they're at this point in time with a view to an application for an extension for, let's say, 3 or possibly as long as 5 years.
I think it's a really good point, is that you do want to have your language be as simple as possible. But I'll also maybe throw another corollary to this, is that in addition to being, you want to have the same people using the same language, but you want to make sure it's not happening is that people aren't using the same terms to mean different things. That's the real danger. That's the real danger. Yeah. So you need to make sure that you've got clarity on definitions, and this gives you a chance, I think, to put together the guidance, and you can actually define what these categories mean, and so that they'll be applied the same way.
Thank you for your presentation. I try my best to understand your presentation. A very simple question. Under your classification systems, we understand that 111 is a certain reserve, and 333 is resources. So is there any turn point from reserve, from resource to reserve?
When does it make the jump from what using the
Yeah.
term? Well, actually, in the UNSC, we don't actually use those terms. We just use the categories, and you can call them whatever you want to. You have the right to make your own names for them up. Conventionally, the jump between resources and reserves would be at a commercial threshold in which something becomes, I'll use the phrase, justified for development. So it might not yet be approved for development, but it's the point in time where it's a project that has there are no significant stumbling blocks to it progressing into a project, and someone just needs to make the decision to go forward. That's the conventional threshold for reserves, for resources to reserves.
Okay. I think there are no further questions. Thank you very much, David and Charlotte also. We'll now break for coffee. Already we have reached about 15 minutes to the time. We'll get back by about 11 o'clock. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to give a presentation now on Crisco, and there's been lots of talk so far about Crisco, and hopefully I can lay some of the perceptions, clarify them, and demonstrate that Crisco really is a very simple system that's well understood by basically the world's mining industry and finance industry, and I think is a very useful standard for where the ISA needs to go next. And I would like to say, following from David's talk, that his description of the relationship between Crisco and the UNFC was a very good summary of it. That is the way we see it. Crisco is the commercial, I guess you would say, area of the UNFC. It's managed under a separate authority, of course, the Crisco committee, but it's the area that relates to market-related reporting. So thank you, David, for presenting that summary well. So moving on to, I have to firstly say that I'm representing Crisco here, even though I'm not currently a member of Crisco, because the entire committee is in Mongolia this week with its annual general meeting, and it's possible as a result of the meeting this week in Mongolia that it will be the latest country to join the Crisco list of member countries. So I'm giving this on behalf of Harry Parker, who apologises for not being able to be here today. I thought I'd better, since I'm not a current member of Crisco, I'd better present my credentials for coming here and speaking to you. So I've been 43 years in the mining industry now, and most of that time has been related to resource and reserve estimation and classification. We'll mention JORC a couple of times in this presentation. It's the Australian reporting standard that was developed in the 1980s, and I was a member of JORC for 18 years and secretary or chairman for 12 of those years. And I was co-chairman of Crisco in 2005 and 2006. That was a fairly important time. It was when we had the discussions, particularly with the UN, ECE. We also had discussions with the International Accounting Standard Board and the SPE and other bodies as well. I'm now a resident of Canada, having moved from Australia 7 years ago, and so I'm very familiar with National Instrument 43-101 as well. I've authored over 20 technical papers on resource classification and reporting. And have been and currently am an expert witness in more than one litigation case that involves resource and reserve estimation and classification reporting. Okay, so the outline will be an overview of Crisco, I'll talk about the international reporting template. I'll then talk about how the template caters for certain commodities or deposit types that require some special clauses. And in my opinion, the template can be very easily adapted to seabed nodule reporting with the inclusion of a few clauses that relate specifically to the special issues to do with seabed nodule mining. And at the end of it, I'll present a recommendation for a way forward. So, just a little bit of background of CRISCO. Its principal objective is to promote best practice in international public reporting of mineral resources, mineral reserves and exploration results. It's an umbrella body, it's a coordination body really of the national resource and reserve estimation committees in each of the countries which are members of CRISCO. Am I blocking you? So the CRISCO template, as I'll explain later, is based on those individual national reporting standards. And there are two representatives from each of the committees in each of the countries that form the CRISCO committee. And as I say, that recognises the truly global nature of the international mining industry these days. These are some of the other objectives of CRISCO. So it, through the template and continuous communications, it does endeavour to promote best practice in mineral resource and reserve estimation and classification reporting. And the latest version of the international reporting template is dated 2013, so it's fairly current. It does represent the international minerals industry in certain international negotiations, including the ones I mentioned earlier on. And we'll talk about the competent person system, and Matthew is going to talk more about that in his presentation. But CRISCO does encourage what we call the international reciprocity of the competent person system. In other words, it promotes the international cooperation and agreement between the countries to facilitate competent persons reporting in more than one environment. Its history is that it formed as a subcommittee of what used to be called the Council for Mining and Metallurgical Industries, which died a fairly untimely death in 2002. There was an accord reached in Denver in 1997 that the member countries at that stage were Australia, Canada, the USA, that's the SME part of the USA, the UK and Western Europe, and South Africa. I think that's right. And in 1997, agreement was reached on uniform definitions for mineral resources and mineral reserves, and the categories or the subdivisions of those that would be common to all of the reporting standards in those countries. As Charlotte and David have already mentioned, CRISCO reached agreement with the UNECE in 1999 for the CRISCO definitions to be the market-related component of the UNFC. CRISCO, in its current form, was formed in Cairns in 2002 at a meeting of the CMMI, where the decision was taken to disband the CMMI. The international reporting template was initiated in 2003, and the latest version is 2013. And we were granted observer status of the ISA in July 2014, for which we're very appreciative. And I'd just like to say a bit about the ICMN. All these acronyms are going to be confusing. The ICMN is not the same as the CMMI or the CIMN. it's the International Council for Mining and Metals, and when the CIMM, I think, I'm getting confused now, disbanded in 2002, CRISCO essentially had no parent body to support its activities and to help fund its activities. So negotiations took place with the ICMM, leading to CRISCO becoming a task force of the ICMM in 2007, and it's now a strategic partner of the ICMM. So just to explain a bit about ICMM, because a fair bit has been mentioned here about the importance of social and environmental aspects of the minerals industry, and that's quite right. And really, this is where the ICMM was formed, in the governance area, the social, the environmental, and just general good practice and performance. It's a CEO-led organisation, so it has the CEOs of the member mining companies, and it's most of the majors and mid-tier mining companies in the world are members of the ICMM. And you can see that it plays a leading role in the promotion of good practice and performance internationally. And that third bullet point, I've emphasised in red the statement of principle of sustainable development. That's recognised as part of the charter of the ICMM. And so, since CRISCO is a strategic partner of the ICMM, it is exposed to the ICMM's aims in that area. I can't say exactly to what degree that there are formal discussions on that, but there is a clear linkage between CRISCO and the principles of sustainable development. Current members of CRISCO are Australia, which is the JORC committee, Canada, and that's National Instrument 43101 that was mentioned earlier, and CIM, which is the Canadian Institute of Mining, Metallurgy and Petroleum, I believe. Chile is a member. Its code is called the Certification Code. Europe and Western Europe, UK and Western Europe is a member. It has a code called the PERC Code, the Pan-European Reporting Code. Russia joined, I believe, a couple of years ago. I'm not sure of the exact date. Yeah, 9, yes. That's the Russian code that is equivalent to a CRISCO standard, is my understanding. And there is also a mapping document between the Russian, if you like, the more traditional Russian reporting system and the CRISCO template. That was also developed as part of those negotiations. South Africa, through the SAMRIC code. USA is a particularly interesting situation, and I could take up 2 hours talking about that. But it's the CRISCO style of standard is not accepted by the Securities and Exchange Commission in the USA. It's the only major regulatory body in, if you like, the Western world or the CRISCO sphere of influence, if you like, that doesn't accept the CRISCO template. It's been a thorn in the side of CRISCO and American companies for a long time. And I'm pleased to say that finally there are negotiations between the SEC and the American Society of Mining Engineers and Metallurgists, not just mining engineers, I think. SMEs. Right. Those negotiations are, I believe, about to start. About might mean in a few months' time, but so I think there's progress on that front as well. And these are the securities regulators that recognise CRISCO-style standards, and I'll re-emphasise here that National Instrument 43101 is a CRISCO-style standard. So is the JORC code, so is the SAMRIC code, so is the PERC code, and the Chilean and the Russian. These are all CRISCO-style standards. So in Australia, it's recognised by the main regulators there, and the main Crisco style reporting standard is the JOR code. We've got securities commissions and the Toronto Stock Exchange in Canada, and it's mainly National Instrument 43101, which incorporates a document called the CIN definitions, resource and reserve definitions. That document is really the equivalent to the JOR code. National Instrument 43101, which I'll talk about, I think, in my second talk, is a governmental legal instrument that references the CIN definitions. So it is, if you like, it incorporates them by reference. Santiago Stock Exchange, ESMA, I'm not actually sure what that stands for, and AIM in Europe, recognizing PERC and all the Crisco aligned standards. Hong Kong Stock Exchange, the New York Stock Exchange doesn't. It's really just to re-emphasize that. Johannesburg Stock Exchange and in Moscow. And when you look at the cumulative capital of the world's mining industry on those stock exchanges that recognize or use Crisco style standards, they account for around 80% of the world's mining capital. Now that was true of a few years ago, I know. I'm not sure of the number right now, but it would be in that order. And if the SEC comes on board through the future discussions, then clearly that percentage is going to increase. Crisco's, and I'm repeating some of what's already been described here, Crisco did enter into negotiations with the petroleum industry, and it created a mapping document under the auspices of the IASB, the International Accounting Standard Board. We were asked to work together to produce this mapping document so that they could be properly informed about standards that might apply to future accounting standards for the extractive industries. That was a very useful exercise. I believe the International Accounting Standard Board accepted the main conclusions out of that there was no need to impose one unified set of definitions on the minerals and the oil and gas industries, because the existing systems were well understood by each of those industries, and they could be mapped to each other, so that the International Accounting Standard Board was comfortable at that time with the idea of extractive industry standards referencing, if you like, resources and reserves at a fairly high level that then encompassed the Crisco standards and the SPE standards under that sort of more general classification. And as has been said several times, Crisco and SPE are both recognized in the UNFC for commodity-specific guidelines. That's part of what I already said. We've been involved in discussions with the International Accounting Standard Board. I don't know exactly where those discussions are now. I haven't been involved for some time. But the elements are all in place anyway for when this initiative is brought to fruition for a new reporting standard to recognise Crisco and the SPE for those two industries. This is another way of looking at what David produced in his talk. It's a simple a simple mapping of the Crisco template categories to the UNFC, and I think this comes directly out of the UNFC document. Is that right, Charlotte? I think that was taken out. Yeah. So you can see that mineral reserves, the proved category, which is the highest category, and I'll describe this in a little bit more detail further into the talk, is essentially EE1. Sorry, E111, EFG 111, and probable is 112, and they're described as commercial projects under the UNFC. Then mineral resources, and I'll explain the difference between resources and reserves because this is a very important concept to understand in the CRISCO definitions. The measured category, which is the highest category of mineral resources, is 221. Indicated, which is the middle level of confidence in estimation, is 222, and inferred is 223. Matthew, in one of his talks, will be, I believe, expanding on how Golder assigned the inferred category to the work that he did with NOMA. I think that's going to be a very useful presentation. And then exploration results sit under 334. That's just to show the current executive of CRISCO. One thing that's interesting, I think, to note is the truly international nature of CRISCO, in that the chairperson is from Chile, the immediate past chair is from Canada, the deputy chairman is from the USA, and the secretary is from Australia. And they change every couple of years, I believe, so it's truly an international committee. I'll now go into the international reporting template. I was thinking when David was speaking, actually, of another way of looking at the way the CRISCO area relates to the UNFC, and I didn't have time to produce a diagram, and I don't have the drafting skills to do it anyway, but it could almost be looked on as a pyramid from the point of view of, if the ultimate aim is commercial exploitation of a particular commodity, then, if you like, the apex of that pyramid are the CRISCO definitions, because that's where we're trying to get to. We're trying to get to definitions that are recognized in the marketplace by most lending institutions and by the regulated stock exchanges and by mining companies worldwide. So it's another way of looking at the relationship between the two. I hope that was an acceptable description. Okay, the international reporting template. Perhaps I should go back one. Each of the countries that is a member of CRISCO does have a reporting standard that it's already developed. These reporting standards have been developed by the industry in each country, not by government, and not by a third party, but by the industry. And some of them have stood the test of time very well. And the international reporting template is really a document that pulls together all of the best, if you like, the common parts of all of those reporting standards, and ensures that it stays up to date with the best practice in each of those countries. Sorry. So, as I said before, CRISCO is an advisory body. It's an umbrella body, more like a coordinating sort of role. But the CRISCO template is based on well-accepted national reporting standards. In the case of the JORC code, which I was heavily involved in for 18 years, the first JORC code was released in 1989. So you can see that's been 25 years. It stood the test of time. It's been modified through that time. And during that period, the CIM standard definitions came into place, which were then referenced by National Instrument 43-101. The SAMREC code came in, the PERC code came in, and the other countries that are now part of CRISCO. So what's been incorporated into the international reporting template, which I think would be a very good model for where ISA wants to go in the immediate future, have stood the test of time. We've gone through some pretty intensive learning periods in that time that the ISA would not need to go through again, at least certainly not to the extent that we had to go through them. So I think there's a real advantage, as with the UNFC as well, have taken advantage of years and years of learning and development to get these standards and systems to where they are. So the template is not something that takes precedence over the reporting standards in each country. It's deliberately called a template so that it's clear that it's not a code, it's not a standard that has any force. It is an advisory document that can be taken by another country that wishes to develop a reporting standard of the Crisco type, and they can just take the template and adapt it as required to their circumstances. Another point to mention about the Crisco template and the reporting standards it's based on, it's deliberately been kept fairly non-prescriptive and fairly wide in its scope in order to be able to cope with the very wide range of mineral deposits that are encountered. This is, makes it very valuable to the ISA in this situation because really I would say 95% of the reporting template could be directly applied to seabed nodules with no change. That would be my rough guess. And I'll explain what the other 5% is. There are 3 principles that underlie the national reporting standards in all of the Crisco countries that also underlie the Crisco template. They're very important. Materiality, transparency, and competence. Materiality is a principle that basically says that when you're reporting, and I'll come back to this concept of the standards are for reporting, they don't set standards for how you estimate, they set standards for how you report what you've estimated. And materiality means that you report all the information that somebody who is reading the report and wishing to make an informed decision on the basis of that report, they have all the information they could reasonably require. That you're not withholding anything that could be influential in affecting that person's decision. Transparency is related to materiality, but it basically says that whatever you report must be reported very clearly and in an unambiguous way, so that it's not capable of confusion or misunderstanding. And competency brings in this very important concept of the competent person. In Canada it's called the qualified person. In Chile they could make up their mind, so it's the competent qualified person. But it's all the same sort of idea. And it's another reason why these standards work as well as they do, because they don't try to specify in detail how you estimate resources and reserves. They leave that to the judgment of a competent person. They provide extensive guidelines as to the things to take into account, and I'll talk about those in my second talk. But in the end, the responsibility lies with the competent or the qualified person to make his or her own judgment as to what is appropriate and applicable in the particular situation, and take responsibility for that. This is just a summary of the type of public reports that we're referring to when we talk about the Crisco standards, like the JORC Code of National Instrument 4301. They relate to the public reporting of exploration results, mineral resources and mineral reserves. They don't dictate how a company reports internally. A company can report in any way it likes internally. But they do dictate how a company reports to the market and to stock exchanges. And these are a number of the types of reports that it applies to. And in red at the bottom, I've just basically summarized, if you like, that the public report, for the purposes of Crisco and its related standards, is really any report that is designed primarily to inform investors or potential investors. So it's a fairly broad application. There are a number of definitions in the Crisco template. and I've listed them all there. So these definitions are there already. They've been developed. They're available for application to seabed nodules. There need to be a little bit of adjustment here and there, but in general, they're again fairly broad definitions that are intended to apply to a wide range of deposit types and situations. This is a diagram you've seen before, and it shows how the categories of resources and reserves relate to each other. We start at the top here with exploration results, which is, if you like, the least, where's the least amount of information. And this is where you are reporting, and again, I'm talking here about, this is to do with public reporting. You may well have, as David and Charlotte have explained, information that predates or is not appropriate for public reporting that you want to classify in some way. That's where the UNFC has a very powerful role to play. I'm talking here about when you are in a position to report publicly or report for the prime purpose of attracting financing. This is the diagram that applies. So exploration results is an early stage where you have exploration results, you want to report them. There are certain things you should do and shouldn't do when you report those, so you don't mislead investors. Mineral resources is where you're able to now make an estimate of the quantity and quality of the deposit that you have. In seabed nodule terms, the abundance and the grade. Inferred is the least confident estimation, and then moving to indicated, and then measured resources is the most confident estimation. So you can see that there's a vertical axis here that relates to geological confidence and knowledge. So it's usually on the basis of increasing information. As you get more information, you're able to make more confident estimates of quantities and qualities. It's important to note that inferred resources, the uncertainty that surrounds inferred resources is such that it cannot be converted to mineral reserves. It needs to be upgraded first to at least the indicated category before it can be converted to mineral reserves. And going back to what Caitlin was saying in her keynote speech yesterday about Herbert Hoover and the very early stages of these classification schemes, that basically the proven, probable, possible reserves, which is still, I think, referenced actually in the ISA, I believe. It's only probably the early 1990s that I think most CRISCO countries did away with the category of possible reserves. It did exist up until that time, but it was decided that it really didn't make sense to have an economic equivalent to a category of inferred resource which has a high degree of uncertainty attached to it. So that category was removed. It no longer exists in any of the CRISCO standards. So these relate purely to the information you have and the confidence you have in the estimate of the quantity and grade. In order to convert mineral resources to mineral reserves, you must consider a number of what are called modifying factors. And I should step back one here, say that mineral resources are not just everything that you've sampled, regardless of whether it's got any chances of being economically extracted. You do have to apply some economic criteria, although they'll be very early stage ones, in order to eliminate material that clearly has no reasonable prospects of eventual economic extraction. So that's an important thing to realize about mineral resources. It's not just everything that's been sampled. It does have economic criteria applied. The conversion from resources to reserves is via the modifying factors, and I'll explain those in a bit more detail. But the measured category of resources, if it satisfies these modifying factors, can be converted to proved reserves. It can actually convert to probable reserves in situations where one or more of the modifying factors has increased the level of uncertainty in the estimate from where it was at the measured resource stage. Again, remember that these categories relate to the confidence in the estimation of the quantity and quality. So you can downgrade a measured resource to a probable reserve if there is some uncertainty attaching to certain of the modifying factors. Indicated resources can only be converted to probable reserves, not to not to proved reserves. How do the time, by the way? Okay. Right. So this is a description of exploration results. And this is the formal description out of the Crisco template. And by the way, I don't have copies of the template here, but they can be downloaded from the Crisco website, which is crisco.com. Thank you. And along with other documents that are there. Mineral resource. So these are that's the formal definition. It's not I've extracted this, so it's not all the words that apply, but I've highlighted in red a very important criteria for mineral resources that must be borne in mind. There must be reasonable prospects of eventual economic extraction. Now, eventual in this situation, there is guidance in the Crisco template of the word eventual, because I think this is going to be very important with seabed modules. And eventual is explained in the template that it could be in the order of perhaps up to 50 years for bulk commodities like coal, iron ore, and so on. Obviously, seabed nodules weren't contemplated at that time. So when you're looking at eventual economic extraction, you are looking at a reasonable time frame. You're not just looking at what might be extractable in the next year or two. That's where you get into the reserves, is what is extractable under the conditions that apply today or immediately in the future. The measured, indicated and inferred categories, as has been said before, the words are not necessarily the best. I'm sure, a bit like David and Charlotte, if we had our time again in developing something like a Crisco template, we wouldn't necessarily use these words, measured, indicated, inferred, proved and probable, particularly measured and proved, because they tend to imply 100% certainty, and they're not 100% certainty. They are subject to uncertainty. There's no international agreement as to what that uncertainty might be, but in general, it can be said that measured or proved is probably somewhere between 5 and 15%, would be my guess, and indicated, probable, perhaps in the order of anywhere from 10 to 20 or even maybe 25%. So you can see that there's still uncertainty in the estimation. The indicated and inferred boundary, that is the most important separation in the Crisco system, because it dictates what can be converted to a mineral reserve. Inferred cannot be converted, indicated can. The indicated measured boundary can be an important one depending how you're looking to finance your project, because some banks require you to have a certain percentage of your reserve in the proved category. That's related to your financing, but critical separation is inferred and indicated. Mineral reserve is the economically economically mineable part of a measured or indicated mineral resource. It includes dilution and losses. So you can think of the simplest way, I think, of a mineral reserve is if you have a treatment plant as part of your process, it's what you intend to feed to that treatment plant, the quantity and quality of the material you intend to feed to that plant. So whatever dilution you're going to incur on the way to doing that, and whatever you might lose on the way to doing that, they have to be taken into account in the reserve. the modifying factors being considered. This slide is actually a little bit out of date. It's now accepted in all of the CRISCO countries, I believe, that in order to convert a mineral resource to a mineral reserve, you must have undertaken a study that is at least a pre-feasibility study. That's defined in the CRISCO template. So that sets the standard for the type of work you have to do in order to convert a mineral resource to a mineral reserve. Those are modifying factors. I'm running out of time to go through them, so I won't go through them in detail. But again, it's important to see that they include social, environmental, they include governmental, they include all the issues that normally would be taken into account. And again, stepping back on the stage, some of these also apply to resources, although they may not be specifically stated there, but because of the principle, there must be reasonable prospects for eventual economic extraction. If, for example, you found a resource or found a deposit that sits under a national park in a particular country, and the government has decided that it will not allow mining in the national park, then you can't call it a resource. Doesn't matter how well you know it. It doesn't have reasonable prospects for eventual economic extraction, so you can't call it a mineral resource. So it does take into account the social, the governmental, and so on. The competent person is a member or fellow of a professional body, professional association, with an enforceable code of ethics. This is so that the competent person, if he or she acts in a way that's not consistent with his or her responsibilities, or in a way that is either well, illegal, I suppose you'd say, or just outside of the normal standards of the industry, they can be brought to account. They can be made to explain their actions in front of the professional body. The body can, if necessary, discipline them by imposing a fine or by actually suspending their license to operate. They must have at least 5 years of relevant experience in the commodity and the situation. This is going to be an interesting discussion with respect to seabed nodules. But it can be resolved. And I think Matthew, in his presentation, will explain how he resolved this situation and persuaded the Canadian regulators, who are probably the toughest in the world, that he did in fact qualify as a qualified person. Competency, whether or not you're a competent person, and this is another situation that differs from country to country, but it's largely a self-declaration. In other words, I can say that in my opinion I'm a competent person for seabed nodules. Now, I wouldn't say that because I'm not, but I can say that. I can say, for example, for reporting of most gold type of deposits, I doubt that anybody would question my competence to report gold deposits to the public. But some countries don't really like this idea that the competent person declares whether or not he or she is competent. They maintain registers of competent persons or qualified persons. There are challenges with the register system as well, but it depends really on the culture of the country, which system you adopt. The disciplinary process of the competent person system is very important, as I've explained. Oh, I thought I'd mention this since Dira Metallica, Agricola, has come into mention a couple of times here. I particularly like the second bullet point. I show this to competent persons quite often when I'm giving a talk, and say that you're lucky that you weren't born in the 1500s. This is a crowded slide, but it summarizes the reasons for success of the CRISCO style template and definitions. And I think, I know I'm running out of time here, but some of the issues are very important to accept. Simplicity is absolutely paramount when you're reporting to potential investors. They won't lend their money to you if they don't understand what they're being told. What we found is the two-dimensional presentation of the CRISCO definitions and so on is a simple one. And because there's only 5 categories there, that's simple to explain and it's simple to understand. That's absolutely fundamental in market-related reporting, is the simplicity of the presentation. As I said, the Crisco template and the similar standards avoid as much as possible overly prescriptive requirements. And again, that's partly what makes them applicable to a wide range of deposit types, and I believe to seabed nodules. These standards all have regulatory backing. In other words, the stock exchanges all support them. And the exception, as I said, is the SEC in the USA, but I'm fairly confident that's going to be resolved in the next couple of years. All of these standards would drawn up by the industry in each country, and I think that's very important. So it means that they're friendly to the industry and to the practices that mining companies actually go through. They're not standards that the government or a government body has imposed on the industry that don't relate in some way to the practicalities of what we do in the industry. And I think the commitment to ongoing improvements and communication is absolutely critical as well. Each of the standards is updated every few years. The JORC code was updated in 2012. The SAMREC code, I believe, is being updated next year, I think. I can't recall, I think CIN standards were updated in 2013, I think, Matthew? Not sure, anyway, fairly recently. So they're all kept current, and because they're all members of this umbrella organisation, and they all cooperate together with each other, there's a degree of leapfrogging that happens. So if, for example, the SAMREC code comes out, and it's got some improvements in it, next time the JORC code is looked at, it will look at the SAMREC code and say, yeah, there's some pretty good things there that make sense for us. We'll include those as well. So usually the latest of the standards is probably the best of them. But that's where the template encapsulates the best of them as well. And it's a 2013 date, so it's very current. I'll have to beg indulgence for a bit more time. Okay. I'm getting on now to where I believe the template can be applied easily to seabed nodules. And I'm highlighting here the fact that although the template and all of the reporting standards it's based on are kept very generic, so they can be applied to a wide range of commodity situations, there are some commodities or deposit types that require special clauses, and the template has those clauses. 3 of them in the Crisco template are coal, diamonds, and industrial minerals. I won't go through the details of what those special clauses are, but they can be summarized in that in some cases there is a terminology that's accepted. If, for example, the coal industry, as Charlotte said, there is a category there called marketable coal. That's very well recognized by the coal industry. It wouldn't make sense for a reporting standard to disallow that style of reporting, because the coal industry understands that, and you don't want to make it more difficult for them to understand what they're being told, otherwise they'll take their money somewhere else. The characteristics of the deposits might be an issue that needs some special clauses. Diamonds in particular, there are certainly issues to do with diamonds that are a little bit different to most other deposits. I think seabed nodules fall to some degree into this category. How reserves are reported, there can be specific things. I've just mentioned coal, industrial minerals. There are some specific ways of reporting reserves of industrial minerals as well that are a little bit different. And the markets may be actually a key issue for some minerals, and again, industrial minerals are one of those. As I said at the bottom, special clauses, I believe, can be drafted fairly easily for seabed nodules. I've listed here some of what, from my reading, and I must say that I'm new to seabed nodules, so excuse me if I've missed out some very important points here, but I think they'll come out from Matthew's talk and others who are going to speak, what the special issues are, but these seem to be some that caught my eye. The sea floor topography is an issue, particularly for reserve estimation, as I understand it. The estimation of the quantity is more challenging than the estimation of quality, as I understand it. Some of the techniques that are currently used, such as photography and the free-fall graph samples, are known to almost certainly underestimate abundance. So that's something that needs to be looked at. What we call QA/QC, which is quality assurance, quality control issues, which are very important in assuring the quality of the data that's used in the resource and reserve estimates. There may be issues to do with that aspect, particularly when we're dealing with data that goes back 30 years perhaps in some situations. Competent person experience, as I've mentioned before, that's going to be something that needs to be sorted out, but again, not impossible. The Crusco style standards went through exactly this situation in the past, and if you like, there needs to be perhaps a little bit of acceptance that there's a learning period in here, and that it'll take a little while for a number of people to get the sort of experience that would ideally be appropriate for acting as competent or qualified persons. But that doesn't mean that in the interim, good understanding of the issues, if not direct, actual hands-on experience, people can still act in that capacity. How to judge reasonable prospects for eventual economic extraction? I think that's a key issue to be discussed here. I know there's been discussion about processing and uncertainties about the future of processing. With respect to the reporting of mineral resources, the uncertainties of exactly how you could extract the minerals aren't necessarily critical to the reporting of resources, as long as you have reasonable expectations that you will be able to recover the minerals, or the metals rather, sorry. So there is that, again, that basis of reasonable expectation that you will be able to achieve something. Now that's not appropriate when you come to the reserve stage, but it's reasonable when you're at the resource stage. Different legal and tenure situation. As I understand it, none of the mining methods have yet been proved on a full commercial scale operation. But I was very interested in Ted's talk today. I learned more about the mining of seabed nodules than I knew before. There may be special environmental conditions, and I guess you could link that to the social and to the license, the social license to operate. And processing options. You may have bench scale tests. What is your confidence in the scaling up of those bench scale tests to a full scale plant and so on? Now, there are probably others I haven't thought of there. I put this in red. This is the final slide, just because I think it encapsulates everything I've been saying. Although extension discussion is required with all the interest groups, which obviously includes all the groups represented here and maybe some others that are not in this room today, extension of the international reporting template to cover seabed nodules, I believe, is straightforward, and it's recommended that it be done. Crusco is very willing, if it's requested, to coordinate and if you like, manage that activity, obviously together with the experienced representatives in their particular areas that would be needed to achieve this sort of thing. And a suggested takeaway from this conference, I believe, if it can be done, is to actually appoint that committee or subcommittee or group. Maybe that's perhaps a little hoping for too much, but I think that may be worth aiming for. And its charter would be to produce recommendations on the extension of the international reporting template to seabed nodules. And in my discussion, second discussion on best practices, I will actually suggest that as a second component of the charter of that group, it develop best practice guidelines as well to cover seabed nodules. That's a bigger job, but again, it's been done for many situations, as I'll explain in my second talk, and I don't see any great problem, in theory, in achieving that for seabed nodules as well.
Just take a couple of questions.
Simple question. Thanks for an impressive presentation. Take the case of nodules and look at the contractors area, which is about 75 square kilometers, which has been sampled by, let's say, 3-4 graphs, even though you said and rightly so that it might underestimate. Even so, using the sample values, if the estimates have an accuracy of, let's say, plus minus 10% on the abundance, and even better on grades, would you consider the resources of the 75,000 square kilometers as measured?
You ask very good questions. There are several aspects that you would take into account when you're classifying. That's one of them, and that's a very important one, but it wouldn't be the only one. For example, the quality of the data that underpins the estimate is very important as well. You can, for example, and I'll use land-based because I'm more familiar with it, you can, for example, have very detailed drilling in a particular area and estimate on the basis of that within, let's say, 5 to 10% in your own judgment. But the quality of the data that underpins it may be such that it adds an extra level of uncertainty that needs to then apply, if you like, to that confidence as well. I will certainly agree that the more intense the sampling data, generally the higher the category of resources. That's correct, yes.
I have no question, just to make some comments. I think the crystal is a very good system. It's very easy, it's very simple, easy to use, and it has been accepted by the world, by security exchanges worldwide. So the mining companies, almost all of the mining companies in the world use crystal system. But there is one problem. It's not crystal problem. It's the authorities problem. Crystal, all of the 5 categories defined by crystal are active. I mean, resources and reserves should be active. Resources have present economic variability. Reserves have present economic variability. Resources have potential economic variability. So both are active. If a property, for a property, there is some 5 years or more, I don't know how long, if without exploration or mining activity, the reserve or reserves should be deleted from the inventory. So so, but for the authority, okay, for the authority, we have some different things. We could not guarantee the resources will be active. That means we should have exploration or mining activities. But UFC has such categories. Some categories defined by UFC include some classes which even though these classes without activity, without exploration or mining activities in future in 10 years or 20 years. But for critical, for the category of critical, if property without activities for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, it would be okay, excluded from the inventory. So that's the problem. Our authority should make some deviation. We should keep some, I don't know if it is true, okay? We should keep some resources, even though without exploration or mining activities, we may keep it for quite a long time. Otherwise, the property becomes zero. The contractors and the authority should not be happy. Nothing to do for everything, for every people, okay? So this is, we should add some category besides the critical categories. We should add some category to keep the resources obtained by the contractors as potential as property of the authority. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I thought it was very good. Let me see my notes. I think I understand. I'm Chilean, so I know very well what we are doing in Chile in the mining. Only 30% of the copper in Chile is state. 66% of the copper is in private hands. I know that we use CRISPR in most of the declaration of the research. And today we are in a situation after 40, 50 years that we need to do remediation everywhere. Right? Could you explain me when I'm looking here at your CRISPR, and in the y-axis you have the increasing level of geological knowledge and confidence. On the x-axis you have the modifying factors, but environmental is put as a modifying factor. I understand mining, processing, metallurgical, economical, but I have a hard time to give a weighing factor as relevant as metallurgical and environmental. But my major concern is that here we are dealing with the resource, which is a mankind property. It's not in the country. It's in the high seas jurisdiction. Most of the programs that are passed in the mining in the individual country are subject to the rules and regulations and governance and legal part of the individual country. Here we are dealing with something that belongs to everybody. I will, from the point of view of the conservation and preservation of the marine environment, I'm not, at least maybe I'm, because I don't understand it, but to put environment at the same level as infrastructure, I think it's a bit oversight.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the modifying factors, if I had more time. In my second talk, I will expand a bit on the points in what we call Table 1 of the CRISCO template and so on, that give guidelines, I guess, to each of the areas that are important for classification, for estimation, classification, reporting. But one thing about the modifying factors to understand is that some of them are, they modify the estimate, such as mining. When you do the mine plan, you take your resource, you apply the mine plan, and when you work out what you'll actually extract from the ground and deliver to the mill, it will be different to what was in the resource to start with. So that's a modification. Metallurgy is similar. But some of them are almost stop-go decisions. And and some of them are more in a way of providing full disclosure so that it's clearly understood the parameters that surround the mining operation, potential mining operation. Environment could be a stop-go situation if it's, I guess, appreciated after the resource estimate that there is a situation where there are no reasonable prospects of this deposit being mined in the immediate future, but there are reasonable prospects in the eventual future. And if it's for environmental reasons, then that could be the basis for a resource staying a resource and not being converted to a reserve. That might be one situation. So modifying factors are not all, if you like, quite got the same quality about them. I think to your other point is more of a general one, which is probably not my area to. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to make just a short comment, maybe, and ask a question. For me, simplicity and flexibility is welcome. If we look at LTC and the ISA, will be comparing or maybe assessing, that's maybe the better word, during consideration of contract extension, will be considering contractors with different objectives, because the contractors have different objectives, and I think that then we should look at the flexibility. And just a comment, and my question is, you said that the boundary between inferred and indicated resources is critical. Then I assume that it must be sharp. Are there any regulations in the CRISCO standards for that step of exploration? Thank you.
Yeah, that's again, we could probably have a long discussion on this one, and I think perhaps Matthew might address it a little bit in his, I'm not sure. It's a judgment. Now, this is one of the things that sometimes concerns people about the competent qualified person system. It does rely on the judgment of a person based on their own experience and so on. And, for example, where I decide the boundary between inferred and indicated might be, and where Matthew decides it might be, may be completely different. But each of us may be convinced, because of our own experience, that we've made a good decision, a reasonable decision. I think that there are sufficient guidelines in the template and in good practice guidelines that exist to be pretty confident that there shouldn't be major differences of opinion between experienced, competent persons. But it certainly is not a black and white issue. There is no sharp boundary. That is something I think that needs to be appreciated. It is a judgment call by the competent person.
Just to follow on that particular comment, I think Matthew touched on a point the other day with Ted talking about the standard mining unit. So I think one of the things that does influence the move from inferred to indicated is your continuity, and then that of course is impacted by how selectively you're trying to mine deposits. So it is a feedback mechanism. So it's very difficult to be too prescriptive on that because technology is changing, ideas are changing, but that's stuff the competent person has to take on board when they make that judgment call. That's true.
There are two interests in parallel here. One is that a mining operation, in preparing its reports, is subject to the regulations of, as I assume, sponsoring state, or particularly the state in which it's getting its financing. The other is the guidance of the Legal and Technical Commission, which would be perfectly in its bounds to issue technical guidance as to, say, the best practices or qualifications of the competent person. I'm not sure how these get balanced, ensure that they
something that the Legal and Technical Commission needs to consider. You said that in some states there are registries where people don't just say, I'm qualified. How do those work? I mean, how does a register function in terms of weeding out incompetent and competent people?
Yeah, that's another good question. I haven't actually had personal experience with one of these registers. I believe it's actually done in Chile. And places like Indonesia, although it's not a member of CRISCO yet. I suspect probably in Russia, I would be guessing there may be registers in Russia, I'm not sure. But the main challenge with maintaining a register of competent persons, now I'll preface this by saying that this may actually not apply in the case of seabed nodules, for a reason I'll come back to. The normal concern we have with trying to maintain registers of competent persons is that to declare yourself a competent person, you can't just say I'm a competent person. You have to say, in what respect am I a competent person? And I think I touched on this before. You know, I could be a competent person for gold deposits, but I wouldn't necessarily be a competent person for seabed nodules. So it's not a title so much, or it's something that you have to qualify your identification of yourself.